We want to bring in Professor Dr. Kenneth Stein, known for studying the Arab-Israeli conflict in historical and socioeconomic context. He spent so many years working with the Carter Center from the 1980s. His years and years at Emory University, he is one of the great academians in the United States, and to think of Jimmy Carter after his presidency, I think, is to think of Dr. Stein. Dr. Stein, thanks for finding time for us this afternoon. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
What's going through your mind right now as you're watching the motorcade proceed over to the Carter Center, a place that you and the former president spent so much time together?
Well, I think, first of all, Jimmy would probably be angry that he's arriving late. He would want to be on time. He left me standing in front of an elevator in Tel Aviv because I was 45 seconds late getting to it. I managed to get to the dinner where we were speaking. First, it's important for me to express my condolences to the family. I met him 43 years ago as an assistant professor at Emory. Worked in helping construct the first programming of the center. And I remember when the Carter Center was a kudzu patch. I remember the controversy over the roadway between the Frederick Olmsted area and the Carters and the Presidential Library committees. It wasn't always pleasant. Sometimes there were some tough moments, but he managed to persevere. But I think that word perseverance is probably indicative of his individuality, his tenacity, and his industriousness.
Dr. Stein, don't you
learn that? It was quite extraordinary how industrious and persevering he was.
Don't you think, as people began to learn about the Carter Center in the early 1980s here in Atlanta, there was a sort of a wink and a nod of, well, this is going to be just another library like maybe Eisenhower's library in Abilene, or in Amana, Iowa, there's Herbert Hoover's, a sort of celebration of the past through the footsteps of an American president. Nobody could have possibly imagined, maybe only you, maybe President Carter, maybe a few other people, about the importance, the significance, and the impact the Carter Center would have not only on this country, but around the world as well.
The Carter Center was constructed as an opportunity to give him a platform to speak out on issues that he felt he had not completed as president. The Carters were crushed when they left Washington, having lost to Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan. And we forget that 81 and 82, he was in the process of trying to figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his life. And with a handshake with Jim Laney at Emory, he decided he wanted to become a university professor. And then they put together a committee of professors to figure out what the center would be. And to answer your question precisely, Jeff, he told us he didn't want this center to be a traditional think tank. He didn't want us to publish scholarly papers. He wanted us to be, and the Carter Center to be active and action-oriented. And that's what it evolved to. I don't think it was essentially established to do the things that it ended up doing. I think it evolved, and I think it went through a couple of major changes, not the least of which is in the 80s we had major meetings at the Carter Center. By the time we got to the 90s and beyond, I think the Carters were roaming the world, doing all their good works.
What was it like to travel in the Middle East with President Carter? And I've heard you relay some stories of, you two were in cabs and just sort of making your way through these countries. What was that like?
Well, I look at a motorcade and I'm smiling to myself because when you drive through Cairo, there's lots of traffic. But to drive through Cairo and not have to stop at a traffic light, that was quite extraordinary for me. He wanted to learn as much as he could about the region. He wanted itineraries planned where he could meet individuals of political importance. He wanted to talk to professors. I remember he insisting on our first trip in '83 that he needed to go to the village where Sadat grew up. And when we went to Syria in '87, he wanted to see the village where Hafiz al-Assad grew up. And on all those occasions, he reminded everyone that he was, in fact, a peanut farmer, that he was, in fact, from rural Georgia. And he felt an affinity for that identity of being people who work with their hands and work hard and put in a day's work.
Do you feel that his first trip to Israel, which would have been in the mid-'60s, I've heard the story of Golda Meir loaned out, I don't think it was the mid-'60s, it would have been the early '70s.
That's correct.
That Golda Meir loaned him with a driver, a sort of rusting Mercedes, as the story goes, and that he was so moved by the experience, that coupled with his deep Christian faith, sort of morphed into this personal take on trying to find peace in the Middle East.
I think he had in his innate nature a desire to bring people together who otherwise wouldn't talk to one another. I think he found his talent as being a mediator. And I think if you reflect on all the things he did, or he tried to do as president, and also in the post-presidency, mediation and bringing people together is what he preferred. He preferred not the use of force. He preferred to have people negotiate logically and make concessions to one another.
If somebody would have told you...
Sometimes in the Middle East, Jeff, you can't do that.
Yeah. If somebody would have told you in the 1970s that the Camp David Accord would still be in effect in 2025, would you have been surprised?
Not in the 70s. Maybe by 78 or 79, because Sadat was so different. Sadat wanted to toss aside ideology for national interest, and so did Begin. I think they were both unique at the moment. I think Carter, while he stewarded the Camp David Accords, I think he was fortunate to have both Begin and Sadat, who were heroes and had the will to change their country's direction by 90 degrees. That doesn't happen frequently in international politics. And Carter was able to use their willingness to make compromises with one another to achieve the Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli Treaty.
But Jimmy Carter's view of the Middle East morphed, and you certainly had a split with him over it. He became a very harsh critic of Israel.
He did, because he felt the Israelis were not doing their part to accommodate to the Palestinians. And underneath that is another part of Jimmy Carter's personality. Carter felt that it was his duty and responsibility to speak for those who were underrepresented or who didn't have a voice, the disenfranchised. And he equated the Palestinian national movement, or the Palestinians, as being a civil rights movement, which a lot of people took offense to because they didn't really believe that a Palestinian national movement would engage in terrorism. So Carter was willing to reach out, be a mediator, but at the same time, he discounted the ideology of people he was trying to bring together, and in this case, Palestinians who sometimes would rather throw bombs than sit at a table and negotiate.
I wanted to get your view on this. Let's play a game of what if we can, for a moment. Let's say the Ayatollah didn't rise until the 80s. Let's say that Ted Kennedy elected not to run against him for the Democratic primary nomination, and that Ted Kennedy wasn't as hostile toward him in Congress, and Jimmy Carter wins a second term. How different do you think his post-White House life would have looked, and would it have included a Carter Center as we see it now?
I don't think any president who was elected in '76 would have been reelected in 1980. I think the economics of 1980 were so different than '76. Hamilton Jordan said it numerous times. He said it wasn't the hostage crisis that kept us from being reelected. It was the economics of home, and it was a divided Democratic Party. Carter was a moderate who wanted to bring the Democratic Party away from its liberalism, and he just couldn't do it. And the American people didn't appreciate him because they didn't feel that he was politically savvy enough to make the kinds of judgments necessary that you needed in international politics.
Do you think that's an unfair take on Jimmy Carter?
I think there's some truth to it. I would rather have you ask the question, if Begin and Sadat would have made peace with Ronald Reagan as president, and the answer to that question would be absolutely no, because Carter had within him this desire to make the world a better place. I'm not saying that Ronald Reagan didn't, but it motivated Carter. It was burning in him. And that's why it burned within him after he was president. That's why he wanted to see negotiations occur. I can't tell you how many times he said to me in a car or in a meeting, if they'd only give me a chance, if they'd only give me an opportunity to do this, I could finish what I started in '79. He was convinced into the 80s and into the 90s that if any successor president would ask him, he would dive right into the negotiating process. He felt that way even after he won the Nobel Prize and earned the Nobel Prize in 2002. He was just committed to finding a resolution to this conflict come hell or high water.
Is that part of his ambition or part of his idealism that seems to have never left him?
Both. No question, it was both.
Ever meet anyone quite like Jimmy Carter in your lifetime?
As smart, maybe my first father-in-law. But Carter had an engineering mind. I don't know if that's an appropriate definition. Carter saw a beginning, a middle, and an end to all problems. And he felt that if you couldn't reach the end, it's because you didn't try hard enough.
What do you think the Carter Center looks like without President Carter
well, I mean, he put a stamp all
ahead?
over it.
What does it look like?
In the early 90s already, with Jim Laney and then a couple of other presidents, and what the Carter Center would look like after Jimmy Carter was no longer around.
Yeah.
And the answer was, well, it'll probably be doing the same things, but probably more broadly. I don't think anyone in 1982 or 83 believed that the Carter Center would end up having individuals, having a staff of 3,500, or people going abroad monitoring elections, or trying to put their arms around terrible diseases. And that certainly wasn't in the mind of the faculty who put the first draft together. It wasn't in the mind of Jim Laney, who was president at the time. I don't think it was in the mind of Emory faculty in 1983 and 84, who actually opposed having the Carter Presidential Library near Emory. They didn't want to be associated with a failed president. A lot changed from 40 years ago to where we are today. And I think because Carter stayed as the main oxygen of the center with his philosophy, I think that's why it became what it was. You know, there's a famous quotation by an author whose name I can't remember. An institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. Well, that's exactly what the Carter Center was and is.
I guess there are so many things about Jimmy Carter that are just hard to understand and hard to explain. Do you remember when you first met him? Do you remember the first time you were introduced to him?
Yes. Yes, it was in 1981 or 82 at the Woodruff Medical Center. We were standing in line as faculty who were about to shake hands with him. And Jim Laney was standing behind him, the president. And we marched in line, one right after another. And he stuck out his hand, and I said, "Hi, I'm Ken Stein." And Jim Laney said he's a professor of Middle Eastern history. And Carter surprised me when he said, "I know you." And I looked at him, I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "I know you. I know you wrote those articles in the Journal-Constitution before and after the Camp David Accords. How did you know 60 or 70% of it before we actually signed the agreement?" I said, because it was all public, and it was all made public by people in the diplomatic corps of the U.S. State Department, and all you had to do was sort of put the steps together. And then he looked at me, he said, do you think I had anything to do with it? I said, absolutely, sir. And then it morphed into a really wonderful meeting in Sapelo Island with all of his foreign policy advisors on, what the center should look like. And Brzezinski took control of the entire meeting, and he's the one that essentially said the first major meeting of the Carter Center will be a Middle East meeting in November of 1983. And he looked at me, and I said, November 83, and he said, yes, Brzezinski. I said, well, that's 5 years after Camp David.
Wow.
And he looked at me, he said, that's what we'll call it.
Wow.
And that's how that evolved.
We have to wrap things up here, Professor Stein. Give me, what are your final thoughts here as we say goodbye to you and we watch these live images from the Carter Center right now as the casket makes its way onto the grounds?
I think Jimmy Carter, and forgive me for saying this, I think he was unprepared to be president because I don't think he had enough knowledge of international affairs. I think he was entirely prepared to be a post-president because he brought his values from rural Georgia with him, where people mattered. I think he was uncomfortable as president because he didn't like the establishment in Washington. Hamilton Jordan said it many times. He said our biggest problem was that we came to Washington thinking we were still governing in Georgia, and it's a completely different political system. We weren't prepared for the obstacles or the elites or the establishment or the lobbying groups. And we could have done better. And he said, sometimes we just thought a little bit too much of ourselves. Hamilton gives some really interesting interviews at the Miller Center after he left being in Washington. Very candid, very honest, very forthright. Carter would say that we lost because of the divided Democratic Party. We lost because of the oil prices. But I don't think Carter would admit or acknowledge that he was not really that well prepared to be president coming from rural Georgia. And the biggest lesson for this, Aisha and Jeff, is our people who become presidents or candidates for president aren't really schooled in the political cultures of the world, because that's not the background from which they evolve. Particularly governors, Reagan, Clinton, Carter, Bush too, they didn't have it the first couple of years. Those who go through Washington ultimately have a better understanding and more savvy. You take someone like Biden, who had 38 years. I'm not sure Trump has it. He may have had it from his first term. But folks who don't understand either how Washington works or international politics have a real tough time in managing foreign policy when they come to office. And I don't know how you remedy that. I don't know how you give someone an injection or a pill on how to become politically aware of foreign cultures.
Professor Kinson.
Can you imagine anyone having to deal with Arafat, Assad, Begin, the Saudi family, and King Hussein, who had understanding of international affairs? Those are the gentlemen that Carter had to deal with. It's like having 7 LeBron Jameses and you've got to dribble against them all. I mean, think about it.
LeBron James when he was with Cleveland, not with the Lakers. Professor Stein, it is always a great pleasure and an honor to be with you, and we always learn from listening to you, and we greatly appreciate your time today.
Good, and thank you for the opportunity.
You bet.
So interesting.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So interesting to hear Professor Stein say how much he was prepared to be a post-president. And I think that's truly what we're celebrating, because that's what we see. The stories that we've done on the work of the Carter Center between he and Rosa Lynn, no one has a presidential library that has done so much, not only for the state where it's housed, but just the world in general.